today's presenters. I would now like to introduce Alan Wolf, Senior Vice President at Everest Group. Take it away, Alan.
Thanks, Colin. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We are glad you are joining us today for our webinar, Contracting for Agile. As Colin said, Lessons from the Trenches in Sourcing Agile Development. It is a beautiful day here in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have two Everest Group partners joining us, one from New York and one from Gurgaon, India. So let me introduce our panelists for today. Jamit Arora. First, Jamit leads Everest Group's IT research practice, which is focused on conducting in-depth research on the full spectrum of technology services across applications, infrastructure, cloud services, and next-generation IT. Jamit's also responsible for Everest Group's vertical-specific research practices that are focused on banking, financial services, and insurance, along with healthcare outsourcing. In addition, Jamit manages a team of analysts dedicated towards serving clients on issues such as sourcing strategy, service provider selection, portfolio optimization, global delivery locations, and risk management. So obviously, Jamit is not switching to decaf anytime soon. Abhishek Sharma. Abhishek Sharma is a partner that leads Everest Group's pricing assurance practice. With over 15 years of experience, he advises clients across 4 continents on themes such as price and performance benchmarking, contract reviews, sole source proposal reviews, and sourcing spend optimization. Before joining Everest Group, Abhishek worked with KPMG's sourcing advisory practice, where he led a number of engagements across the sourcing lifecycle, serving clients in North America, United Kingdom, and Asia Pac. He also started his career with McKinsey & Company as an analyst in their business technology office. So you can see you're in great hands today with Jamit and Abhishek. So why don't we move forward to just the context for our call today? Well, Agile has been around for a while. So the question is, why are we talking about it now? Well, quite frankly, over the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a surge of people experimenting with Agile, and there seem to be a lot more questions regarding Agile. So we thought that it would be a great opportunity to spend the next hour talking about that. As you can see also, we've shared where our data for today's webinar comes from. So it comes from our sole source and competitive deal advisory experience, perspectives, and then also our fact-based IT services research on leading service providers. So that all is in context for what we'll be talking about today. So why don't we move to how we're going to break out our webinar. We're going to start out with, okay, why Agile, why it's important, but most importantly, why is it important now? Then we're going to talk about really implications of Agile on key contracting terms and tenets. Lastly, we're going to share with you what we consider are 7 guidelines for equitable Agile contracting, and that will give everyone kind of a checklist, if you will. And then lastly, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free during the session to write your questions, as Colin said, into the question panel, and we will try to get to it. Honestly, we have a large number of people that have joined today's webinar, which we're thrilled about. So it might take a little time to get to all of them, but we will capture all of your questions and make sure we answer them either on this webinar going forward. One last bit, the question we get asked on every webinar multiple times, and the answer is yes. Yes, you will receive a copy of the slides from today's webinar. So that will go out within the next 48 hours. So expect to receive that for joining today's webinar. With that said, what we want to do really is start out with a poll question. We do this, we have 3 of these during today's webinar. It gets everyone involved and it helps us understand our clientele on today's webinar. So I want to start off with the poll question of what percentage of software development teams in your organization leverage Agile practices? And you could select one of the, we don't use Agile, 1 to 10%, 11 to 30%, 31 to 50%, or over 51%. So please vote now. It makes us very happy when we have a large percentage of voters, and we'll keep the poll open for another 3 seconds or so. And 2, and 1. And why don't we close the poll? And now we'll see what our results are. So this is pretty interesting. It's evenly spread, about a third, give or take, from 11 to 30, 31 to 50, and then 51% are over. So that's great. So let me start off by handing it over to Jamit Arora. And Jamit, let me ask you, based on this poll question, does that align with what you're seeing in the market, or is this slightly different?
Well, Alan, this is very interesting results, and in some ways this is consistent, but in other ways we're seeing an audience here that's definitely a lot more mature in terms of using Agile. And if I were to kind of put this in context of some of the research that we've done, we can show some of the stats that we've looked at in terms of what's really going on in terms of Agile development. So if you look at the graphic on the left-hand side, I think what's become really apparent today is Agile is being used extensively in organizations in terms of, if you were to ask a question, are you or are you not using Agile development methodologies in your organization? Greater than 90% of these organizations say, yes, we do. And definitions might vary, but I think what's become quite clear right now is that if you're a large organization, 9 out of 10 times when we ask the question, we get a confirmation that yes, Agile development methodologies are being used. I think where the poll was interesting was because the highest percentage was in that 31 to 50 and 51%. Both of them had 11 to 30% was where we had the maximum distribution. At 31%, people saying that's our extent of degree of Agile. Across the universe, as we've looked at it, less than 20% typically consider themselves to have high levels of maturity when they're using Agile development. So I think the audience here definitely seems a bit more mature in their leverage of Agile, but key adoption trends, the way we see it, large breadth of adoption, if I may, as we think about it on the left-hand side, but the maturity for the industry is still low. As we move to, just to do a quick recap, and some of this is 101 stuff to set the stage in terms of why does this become different as you think about contracting. As Alan, you mentioned before, the philosophy and concepts of Agile are not new. In fact, for those of you, and most of you I'm sure are familiar with the Agile Manifesto, that was released over 17 years ago in February of 2001. So the concepts have been here for a while. If we were to just recap very quickly what some of the big changes are between traditional versus Agile development. In the traditional world of software development, we had well-documented requirements, well-specified requirements. Whereas in Agile, however, you work with high-level requirements that evolve as the project progresses. Second, the approach in the traditional waterfall method tends to be linear, whereas Agile embraces more of an iterative, ongoing evolutionary approach. Third, there's a lot of documentation that is expected in the traditional model, whereas in Agile, reviews are on the go and emphasis is less on that full-blown documentation. And finally, this is where I think it gets real, because we're talking about this in the context of outsourced services. When it comes to waterfall, the traditional approaches thought of client involvement in phases. There were handoffs when the development team would execute on the project, and once you had certain progress after 4 weeks, 6 weeks, you'd come back and engage the client on a key milestone or a key phase. Agile is very different because you want to have almost a consistent set of customer and stakeholder involvement. And I think it's these high level, and this is again, as I said, 101 stuff, but I think it's important to recap on these because these have some very profound implications in terms of what that means to contracting. As we move to the next slide, I think what becomes important, and this is where we thought it's important to examine this issue right now. Over the last 6-9 months, as Alan mentioned, there's been an explosion in terms of organizations' interest in Agile. At the same time, there's also a fair amount of disillusionment, if I may, because most people want to accelerate their journey, but are unable to because they feel they're not really getting the results that they expected to get from the Agile work. And we believe that that's because enterprises are making some mistakes, if we may take the liberty of saying that, in terms of embracing the concepts which aren't really resulting therefore in delivering the full value that they would expect. So some of the most common issues that we see are highlighted on the left-hand part of your screen. The first one is, trying to do Agile in Waterfall. And that's something which, as a purist, annoys me a fair bit. But let's take an example, right? There are companies that say, you committed, we want to do Agile, but they spend 8 to 12 weeks on requirements analysis, 12 to 16 weeks on strategy and roadmap, and then finally, when they get to the development phase, that's when they say we're going to use Agile. This is not Agile. This is essentially Waterfall. So I think unless you change the process end to end, you're not really going to get the full results. Now, we recognize that every situation is unique, but I did want to call out that, if you're going to embrace Agile only in some aspects and not truly, we think that becomes an issue. If I think of some of the other challenges that we see, there's something which we call as stopgap Agile, which is essentially embracing Agile when you think you're running out of time, right? So you started off in a traditional manner, and as timelines got compressed, you said, let's change the delivery model in flight. That's not going to work either. A couple of others that we think are important is there's some organizations that are getting obsessed with change, fixated with Agile. In fact, we had one enterprise recently, a large bank, tell us, hey, we want 70% of our IT budget to run Agile. And we looked back at them and said, that doesn't even make sense, right? So just trying to embrace Agile just for the sake of change is again going to lead to disappointment. Trying to do things too quickly, we think that's an issue. And then Agile washing, right? People want to claim credit. Hey, we've made a lot of progress on Agile. So that whole painting everything with an Agile brush, we see that as an issue. And what does that truly result in? You don't get the business outcomes you expect. You hire a lot of good talent that gets frustrated and leaves. There's increased cost of management. Scalability becomes an issue. So all of these things have convinced us that the industry needs a bit of an intervention to really make sure that they're doing Agile right, especially when they're trying to leverage third parties in an outsourced manner. Alan, back to you.
Great, thanks, Jamit. So now that we've kind of set the stage on Agile and why it's important, let's get into more depth about really the implications of Agile on contracting. And you could see we're going to talk about this, but let's talk about the 5 key tenets we've seen about Agile contracting. So the first one on the next slide is we talk about scope definition, delivery model, commercial terms, performance metrics, and other T's and C's. So what I'm going to do now is ask both Jamit and Abhishek to walk through each of these key tenets in greater detail so everyone on the call today can understand what we think is critical in each of these areas. So why don't we start off, and Jamit, I'm going to ask you first to talk about the fundamental themes that differentiate Agile contracts.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'll take the first two. So let's maybe start with the scope definition piece, because that in some ways is foundational, right? And think of this as what we are trying to describe are some principles to keep in mind as you are trying to create enterprise grade Agile contracts in an outsourced model, right? And I think the as we think about contracting for Agile, one of the key differences, and often this is the first hurdle or the first question that we get from sourcing groups, is that Agile contracts are not highly prescriptive in defining the exact project scope, So how do I really repurpose my old templates to kind of make this work? And I think in a lot of situations, what we tell our clients, yeah, maybe you do not repurpose the old templates, because a lot of the terms that we were used to in traditional are not even describing the key tenets which Agile uses. And as you're thinking about scope definition, we believe two key terms start to become really important. One of them is definition of done, or DoD, and the second one is product backlog. Let's look at each of these in a bit of detail, right? So if you think of the definition of done, this replaces the traditional requirements list that you see in a waterfall project. And what does done really mean? I mean, it's simple English, but if you were to think of it in terms of what, say, the Scrum Institute or the Agile Alliance would describe this as, done means that the software that's been coded, it's coded to standards, it has been reviewed, it's been implemented with unit test driven development, it's been tested with automation, and it's integrated and documented, right? So that's essentially the full scope of what the definition of done means. But it can obviously happen in different aspects of the release cycle. Effectively, what the definition of done ensures is to make sure that everyone on the team knows exactly what is expected of everything that the team delivers, right? Now, as you're thinking of the definition of done, this can be applicable at a feature level, so which could be a user story or a product backlog item. I'm going to come to product backlog in a minute. It could be definition of done for a sprint, which is a collection of features or collection of stories, or it could be definition of done for an entire release, right? So potentially whether or not that piece of code is ready to ship. Another way of thinking about definition of done is creating product that is deployable, right? And I think the definition of or understanding the distinction between deployable and deployed is important, because not all elements of the product are immediately deployed, but it has reached a condition where you can deploy it, and the standard time frame that you tend to see around this is 2 days. If you think that the product can be deployed in 2 days, folks would consider that yes, it meets the definition of done. In addition to definition of done, product backlog is another important term in agile development. Think of the product backlog essentially as a list of all things that need to be done within the project. It replaces the traditional requirement specification artifacts, right? It's a running list which usually doesn't end. And this could be either items that are technical in nature or can be user-centric in the form of user stories. What this fundamentally results is in a reduction in acceptance-related risks, because we've got iterative delivery, where we've got well-established and well-documented definition of what done looks like and what that true product catalog looks like. So as you'll see, the way we describe the scope in an agile contract is very different from how you would think of it in a traditional waterfall construct. And embracing these principles of definition of done and product backlog become really important to design the right kind of contracts and SOWs. With that, let's move to the next element of the discussion, which is the delivery model, right? Well, the most common questions we get when we think about agile is, hey, what does it really do to my delivery model, right? And can I keep my same on-off ratios? What's to happen? And Abhishek's got some interesting stats for us, so I'll probably just quickly share some high-level perspectives. First, what we see is that Agile introduces a lot of new roles into the construct, and you've got Scrum Masters, product owners, Agile coaches, DevOps engineers. They come together to form a small cross-functional team that people can call a pod, etc. Right? The interesting thing, as you'll see, is I mentioned that you've got DevOps, you've got testers. So one of the implications by way of Agile, which is most of us run large test COEs, right? What we are seeing is as organizations ramp up their agile development efforts, the requirements of a test COE starts to diminish, right? So in general, if you're doing more agile and still retaining the number of independent testers, you're probably not doing it right. Another element of agile is that agile favors persistent teams, right? And what persistent teams essentially imply is that we aren't really trying to churn the pyramid. We are trying to force low attrition with a co-location strategy. This usually translates to a higher onshore ratio, probably for a while, right, as we're kind of ramping up. And then my colleague Abhishek will get into the economics of what that means. So what do on-off ratios look like? What does that do to average daily rates, blended rates, etc.? All of that starts to change, right? More often than not, however, for complex and large enterprise clients, we are seeing agile being deployed across locations by using technology such as telepresence, virtual collaboration rooms, etc., to collapse the distance between team members. And some enterprises might say, okay, for a particular kind of application which is more consumer facing, we're going to do it in a particular model which is co-located. For some other efficiency oriented or back office applications, we are okay with having the entire pod or scrum team offshore. And if you were to kind of go back and ask, okay, what is the ideal structure of the agile pod? We kind of joke about it in an interesting way. If you go to slide 13, the fundamental question we get is, how big should it be? Should we distribute it or not distribute it? And we tend to think of it as a team should be large enough so that it can be fed by 2 pizzas, and it should be close enough that you can hit each and every member of the team with 1 Nerf ball. And that, by the way, is considered, even if you go back to the manifesto, they do not mention pizzas, they do not mention Nerf balls, but in a sense, what you're looking at is a 8 to 12 member pod, which is working in close proximity to maximize the value from Agile. Alan, I know we're trying to kind of see where the group is at, so should we open the next?
Sure. Why don't we take another poll? And I'm still figuring out the whole pizza Nerf ball scenario. I love that. But for our next poll question, everyone, the question is, what kind of deployment model do you use for your agile development teams? So the choices are A, co-located in one or multiple onshore locations, B, present in the same time zone, either onshore or nearshore. C is 1 to 2 key resources onshore, the rest offshore. D is distributed agile with a combo of on, off, and nearshore. And F is other, another break-off piece approach that you take. So once again, it is co-located onshore, full stack teams are deployed, present in the same time zone, 1 to 2 key resources, or distributed. And we'll keep the poll open for another couple of seconds. Hopefully everyone is exercising their right to vote. And why don't we close out the poll and let's see how the results came about. So once again, a pretty even breakout. However, D is 60% is distributed agile with a combo of on, off, and nearshore. So that's a big chunk of our market here, our clientele today. So let me take this opportunity to hand it over to Abhishek and ask Abhishek the same question regarding the poll. Based on our research and what you've seen, Abhishek, does this align with the greater environment in terms of agile development teams?
Sure, Alan, thanks. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, I think the messages are kind of consistent, right? So just in terms of background to this slide, what we did as some research and analysis over the past 12 months was to figure out that, hey, let's take two different kinds of projects and see, based on our experience working over the years with multiple enterprises, what shift in onshore-offshore ratios have we seen. So and if I were to correlate this with the poll, I think it kind of has the same messaging that yes, while there is movement between a pure onshore-offshore model with trying to have maximum people offshore, at the same time, it's not that everything has moved completely onshore or completely co-located as well. So it's a mixed bag. But what that translates into is that there is quite a lot of work being done onshore, right? When it comes to Agile. So we've moved to situations where we have like 14 to 18% onshore, or 16 to 20% onshore, the broad ratios. That has actually moved up to anywhere between 27 to 33%, depending on the kind of projects. And that's required because many of the Agile coach, program managers, senior SMEs, and Scrum Master need to be onshore, co-located with product owners, which is something which is driving that ratio. So again, and a question which is often asked to us is that does this actually mean that there's a commensurate one-to-one increase in cost, increase in overhead when it comes to that? Clearly, the answer is no. As we talk about some of the commercial implications of this, because while this has an implication in some shape or form on the direct P element, which is the price, because onshore people are more expensive, this also has implications in terms of the Q. How much more efficient a particular development methodology is. Right? And then there are of course benefits in terms of early testing, benefits in terms of fail fast, which come into play when we look at the entire project lifecycle. So having said that, if we just go to the next slide and delve into some interesting observations on pricing and commercials. Right now, this is something which obviously among our clients, among stakeholders we interact with the industry, generates a lot of passionate questions, generates a lot of debate, healthy debate as it comes to it, not surprising. But if you were to look at different kinds of pricing models, payments, where does the rubber hit the ground, right, in terms of Agile? Is it actually different? Is it similar? Is it old wine in in a new bottle? What exactly is it? So we've just chosen some tenets where we'll provide some experience based on the past 12 months of movement in this market.
Abhishek,
yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. We're having a little audio problem. Could you try to speak a little closer to your microphone?
Sure, just a minute.
Thank you.
Is it better now, Alan?
That is great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Actually,
So,
Abhishek, we had a request from the audience to see if you could just repeat some of the high points of the previous slide.
Okay. Yeah. So net on the previous slide, we were talking about the difference in onshore versus offshore models. The key takeaways are one, yes, the offshoring, the onshoring, onshore ratios have increased. Depending on the type of project, it could be anywhere between 27 to 33%, whereas we'd actually moved on the SDLC side to a very minimal offshore component earlier. So yeah, that's been a change because of some key roles being positioned onshore. The quick question that comes after that is that, hey, does this mean a one-to-one correlation in terms of a price increase? Well, yes, in terms of a pure price increase, it does. But price isn't the total cost that an enterprise pays, right? P is just one part of it. There's also, the efficiency and some of the other benefits which we'll articulate in a few of the subsequent slides, which means that, onshore ratios and higher onshore component shouldn't necessarily be a cause of worry. It's just a very different model, which has other implications associated with it. Okay, moving to the next slide. Yeah. So on this one, if I were to look at some of the key tenets of commercial terms, some of these you'll find are similar, right, to SDLC. Some of these are different or may even sound counterintuitive, which does lead to a lot of healthy debate. So in terms of the most prevalent pricing model, right, we've seen that time and material, either capped or target cost, depending on the particular situation, is the most prevalent mode of charging, primarily due to transparency and flexibility benefits associated. And the rationale philosophy behind this is that, hey, when we are engaging in an agile construct, we want the provider to focus on the product features, focus on speed, focus on collaboration, feature points, all of that good stuff, as opposed to just keeping on watching the wall. And as Jimit had mentioned earlier on in the conversation, that how is it really possible to bake in or kind of project something which is very, very hard to define? In a highly evolving tenant, in a highly evolving environment, it just becomes very difficult. And if someone were to do it, it's very natural that the focus is entirely on the wallet as opposed to the features. So a lot of enterprises and service providers are actually using time and material quite effectively. There could be multiple sort of variations of this. For example, we've seen recently that target cost kind of models have been leveraged more effectively for engagements where the scope and endpoints are envisioned relatively better. For example, SAP S/4HANA, for example, is deployed in a sprint-based fashion, where the solution validation or blueprinting stage made it possible in a recent environment for the architects to do a need gap analysis, right, to the organization's current business processes. So obviously, a lot of that pre-work somehow helped to put some kind of a target cost. It was still T&M, but they could put some kind of a target cost and move ahead with it, which gave both parties some level of clarity on the objective and some level of coverage to the enterprise that it's not really going to be an open check. The other model which we're seeing is progressive, right? Progressive contracts where scope is defined on an iterative basis. That's when kind of you actually go back, revisit the commercials, after every iteration. And this we're seeing is prevalent on very high variation custom projects. So there's a kind of a rolling view that one takes towards the pricing model, which keeps things open from both sides. The third model is more around per sprint or per agile pod-based pricing. This is where there's enough experience either on the provider side or on the enterprise side to be able to project what the sprint cycle duration is, what the team composition is potentially going to be, right? And they've been agreed mutually. So it's some kind of a catalog view that, hey, this is what it's going to cost, and obviously provides much more clarity. But like I said, there's a bit of a caution here to be used that it needs to be very, very well defined on both sides. Otherwise, you run into the risk of the same, constantly watching the wallet, as I articulated. In terms of some of the payment mechanisms, so we talked about the pricing models. It's common to pay about 100% of the agreed iteration price at the end of each iteration. And though there are models where a holdback is kept for certain milestones, there's still 100% is quite common. The last point that I want to make here is that there's low risk premium overall, right, within Agile. And this is because of the fact that there's constant testing, there's constant iterations. Some of the other contractual tenets are more about ease of termination both sides. So there's not as much of a risk of long-term commitments which one needs to bake in for, right? It's more about getting stuff done rather quickly, failing fast, and then moving forward. So having said, so some interesting context, let's see, what it means for the overall commercials. If you move to the next slide, please. Right. So we'd mentioned we'd made a point around higher onshore ratios. I'm sure a number of us have actually heard that Agile specific resources are expensive. So the question comes, what really happens to my total cost, right? So if we were to just do a kind of a simulation, and this is again based on some examples. This is illustrated. It could vary by situation, but we've taken a typical situation. So if we were to say that, you know, for considering a fixed pool of, you know, ADRs, for example, for a similar project, if the total cost, right, for SDLC or a waterfall, or an average daily rate, so to speak, right, you know, which is the total number of hours and the total kind of, you know, day rate, the weighted average of that. If for SDLC it is 100, if we were to move to Agile, how does that move? And that's the left-hand side of this chart. So the impact due to premium and senior resources overall is 2 to 5%, even though the specific resources may be 5 to 10, 12% more expensive. There's still in the wider team, there could be others who do not command a certain premium. The major difference does come through because of the higher onshore resource mix, right? So SDLC has a lot more offshore. Agile will have more onshore resources and some of the more senior ones. So that's about another 14 to 16%. So if we look at one lens, which is the average daily rate, it could go up by 16 to 20%, which is expected. Having said that, is that the total story? Clearly not. Does this mean, you know, you pay 16 to 20% extra every time? No. Given the way Agile projects are structured, you know, the constant testing, the amount of rework is materially lower. Teams become much more efficient, obviously because of co-location, the way they're structured. There could be a reduction of up to 20 to 25% of net effort in Agile versus SDLC. And this is more to do with a lot of sometimes, you know, as I mentioned, rework coming through. The testing is at the end, so there's a lot of kind of iterations which go into that. Multiple factors which come into play, which even despite a 16 to 20% increase in average daily rate, the number of days required or a number of effort or the effort required is significantly reduced. So we can look at effectively a net reduction in overall project cost. And I'm not even counting the benefits of, you know, better speed to market, you know, better product quality, etc. So net, I think, you know, comparing on a total cost basis, right? There's no need to be scared. Agile economics are definitely not necessarily higher than traditional models. Like I said, you know, these could vary. This is an illustrative slide, but yeah, the whole point is we shouldn't.
Abhishek?
We should. Yeah.
Repeat that again. Sorry, you went blank.
No, I did go blank for about 3 seconds. Okay. Yeah, so you didn't miss anything. So net, I think the key takeaway here is don't be scared if you see you know, day rates coming up higher. The total cost is something which everyone should be focused on. Now, if we move to the next slide, if you may. Right. So we talked about delivery models. Jimit spoke about you know, the broader tenets. I spoke a little bit about the onshore-offshore ratios. We spoke about pricing models. Performance metrics can't really be left behind, right? Because it's all about pricing and performance, as we may call it. So the SLAs and KPIs do change. I'd rather go to the extent of saying materially, right? And the traditional metrics tracked within waterfall development contracts, they're simply not sufficient for Agile-based contracts. As you can expect, totally different ways of working, different manifesto, you know, that there's quite a lot of difference which needs to be captured. So what really is the difference here, right? So the themes of traditional waterfall work pretty well for metrics. They work pretty well for a standard linear approach, right? Because they were all focused on efficiency and accuracy, right? So if you look at metrics like defect density, defect leakage, effort or cost variance, rework, very, very aligned and pretty much work well for a waterfall concept. Agile is about iterations. Agile is about product features. Agile is about speed. So some of them will clearly not fit here. So this introduces KPIs which focus on themes such as cycle time, themes such as business value linkage, feature completion. So while we'd say that some of the core traditional ones, they haven't really died, some of them may still be applicable at an overall level. Some of these new ones definitely need to be introduced in the contract so that there's better coverage and better transparency during reporting, which is much more aligned to what we're trying to do. And we'll share some examples in the subsequent slides, but these could be project velocity, end user satisfaction index, number of features accepted. So you'll see that rather than the traditional ones, which are kind of static, these tend to be much more dynamic, right? Much more frequently reported, so to speak. The key message here is that also acceptance criteria need to be very closely tied up to these metrics and institutionalized, right? Because everything is so happening at such a fast rate, it's high speed, and unless there's some meat, unless there's some teeth in these metrics to be associated with acceptance criteria, we're sure to leave some value on the table. So if we go to the next slide and just try to bring some of these to life, what we've done here is just kind of covered two elements, right? So, and I'll cover the second one first. So the evolution of KPIs. So these are a few examples that we used. The velocity rate of burn down, right? The description. It's as prescriptive as number of story points delivered by a 7-member team in a 3-week sprint, right? What are the kind of benchmarks we're looking at? Lenient to stringent, accuracy of commitment, right? Planning commitment, load factor. So some of these aspects, which we are clearly not seen on the SDLC life cycle, they are seen here. So it's very important for enterprises to have a view, not just about what these metrics are, but also about what are the contemporary acceptable targets, which one should be aiming for. The second element, or the first one in the slide, which is associated, is that Jimit mentioned about evolution of roles, right? As you can see, from a core project manager, deployment engineer, release manager, you have the ones like Scrum Master, Product Owner, Agile Coach, DevOps Engineer. Be prepared for an FTE rate increase as compared with traditional roles. Right? Now the extent of that FTE rate increase for these roles could vary. But yes, they do still command a premium, which is kind of converging, but in the market it is.
So Abhishek, let me ask you a question on that. If we're saying that there's a rate premium, so it sounds like you're saying that all agile projects are going to be more expensive than traditional or waterfall projects. I guess the question I would ask is it worth it, and why do you think it's worth it?
Okay, good question, Alan, and not surprising, because that's often the perception which comes through, and we need to peel the onion a little bit, right? So allow me to do that. So there's two elements of this, right? One I've talked about, there's an actual price premium, right? And then there's higher onshore, which obviously pushes up the components of the total cost, right? So there's no two ways about it. The nuances that I want to mention are, number one, should an agile specific skill cost 30% more than a normal skill? Perhaps not. Right? The range that we see, depending on the specific resource, could be in contemporary times anywhere between 5 to 12%, right? Depending on what kind of a role we're talking about. The second point also is that this is not applicable across all roles working on the particular project. Some of those will still not command a premium. So it's not that everything and each and every person would command that premium. So that's why in the waterfall chart, which we just showed, the net impact of rate differences is much lower than the 5 to 12% that I mentioned. So that's point number one. Now, in terms of the efficiency benefits that I spoke about, the net project cost could actually be lower than an SDLC environment. So the point is that one shouldn't just look at the average daily rates or higher onshore effort or some of those elements and think that, hey, they need to budget more for Agile, but it's more about the end-to-end TCO view, which needs to be taken into consideration. Does that help answer the question?
That's great. Thank you. Super. Why don't we move on? I know we're
let's move on.
A little close on time.
Absolutely. So, and this is something, what are some of the other common terms and conditions, right? So it does have an impact on typical clauses. Highlight message here is that some of the clauses will on the face of it look pretty similar, right? A contract will be a contract. They'll have rather similar, legal language, but there are some nuances which actually come through which are different, right? And the most prominent ones and the material ones are, because of the risk being less in Agile, right? The appropriate limitations of liability could be kind of lower, right? A warranty period is now tied to each iteration as well as to the overall project, just given how the project is structured and their iterative deliverables. A material one is penalties for early termination are significantly less stringent than waterfall-based contracts. So if you look at termination for convenience or termination without cause, in standard contracts, they tend to be at least 90 to 180 days of notice with multiple financial implications. It's much streamlined and much simpler here. IP rights typically remain the same, but with minor tweaks around iterative or incremental IP development, right? And then indemnification clauses are similar. So again, just to summarize, a lot of similarity, but with some tweaks to align with the changed model. And we'll bring it to life, this rather relatively theoretical piece that I've spoken about. If you look at the next slide, there's some interesting observations over there. Yeah, so these are actually sanitized extracts from actual Agile MSAs and SOWs. And if someone were to spend maybe an hour looking at an Agile contract, an hour looking at it at an SDLC contract, MSA and SOW, they won't look very different, right? But as they say, the devil's really in the detail, right? When you look at some of those individual elements, that's when some of the differences start coming through. So look at the tenure of the MSA, the left-hand side first box. Typically for some of the standard contracts, the MSA could be anywhere between 2, 3, 5 years. That's how it's structured. In this case, it was just 1 year. So basically, this just means that these contracts are a much lesser tenure, no long-term commitments from either side, but it's more about just getting the stuff done and moving on. The second element is termination clause. I made a point around 90 to 180 days notice for any termination for convenience, and then there's a chart which goes around what kind of money they need to pay. In this one, we had the customer has the right to terminate this MSA without cause by just giving 30 days notice to the supplier, and there were very minimal financial implications related to the work that was actually going on at that point in time. So again, high levels of simplification when it comes to any stickiness or any kind of binding commitment on both parties. The right-hand side is about the SOW. So again, very similar, kind of a responsibility matrix, but the difference that you see instead of a standard, hey, this is what the supplier does, this is what the enterprise does, you have it actually split out by what's the Scrum Master's role, what's the Agile team's role, what's the product owner and the client team's role. So more split out, much more transparency, and generally you'll see that the list of activities as well, responsibility. So I've just taken a snapshot of 6 or 7. It tends to be a bit longer and much more action oriented as opposed to the traditional linear ones, which some of them tend to be philosophical, some of them are action oriented, but you'll see a lot more very clear focus because there's clearly no time to just go back to the contract every time and reflect on whose responsibility it is. So again, subtle nuances which come into play. Back to you, Alan. I think we've got another.
Great, thanks.
Poll question.
Well, why don't we take a moment now? This is our last poll question of the day, but Jamit and Abhishek have spent a lot of the time today exploring areas within Agile that we feel are different today. Now we want to get a better understanding of where our audience views your key challenges. And what we are asking is, what is the most tangible challenge you face when drafting Agile contracts? Is it contracting for something that is hard to define? Is it definition of acceptance criteria? C, management of IP rights? D, agreeing on the pricing model that maximizes value? Or E, aligning on the appropriate performance metrics? So these are all challenging. Please feel free to select one. And we will keep the poll open for another 3 seconds. I know we've got about 8 minutes left. So why don't we close the poll and let's see how everyone voted. So once again, other than management of IP rights, we had a pretty even split, which is very interesting, and we'll touch on that because as we go to our last area for the presentation today, we're going to talk about what we consider 7 key guidelines for equitable agile contracting. We've seen that these are all issues. A lot of people are having challenges with that. So I'm going to go back to Abhishek and ask him to kind of quickly go through these 7 guidelines as everyone starts thinking about contracting or continues to contract.
Sure, Alan, thanks. And the poll answers also, they were broadly aligned to what perhaps I thought may come through, right? And it's not surprising that there's a lot of questions sometimes around scope, the right pricing models, performance metrics, because there's still a lot of inertia in the industry, right? It's hard to change overnight, certain ways of working. But at the same time, what we've tried to do on the page being displayed is just use some of our recent examples of working with enterprises on multiple such contracts to figure out, what really changes, what really are some of the tenets to bear in mind while for equitable agile contracting. So first one is, again, balancing stringency of contract terms based on the merits of the project. One of the pitfalls that we've seen and continue to see is that, most organizations may want to use a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So an approach which they're using with one part of the member portfolio, they'll try and use it with another, part of the supplier portfolio. Right? So, for example, where there's still not that much of a trust developed between the enterprise and the service provider, the metrics, the clauses have to be sharp. Even though it may look slightly counterintuitive to Agile, you still need to have that cover to provide that internal comfort. And then, for a provider where you do have that relationship, those need to change. So it's very important to look at the particular merits of the project, the context, and then contract for that. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all or a standard thumb rule which can be applied. The second is very, very important practically is instituting a practical dispute resolution process. Now, what we've seen in traditional contracts is that, yes, there is governance in play. There is a dispute resolution process, but that tends to be sometimes protracted, very long drawn, going through multiple layers, which may not work here because in a linear environment, it may work pretty well. In this case, it's about intense work, forward-looking focus. So it has to be practical enough that while the dispute is being resolved, it doesn't stall the entire project, right? Because that would have serious implications on commercials as well as timelines. I made a point around, which is the third point, around easy and financially non-punitive termination or exit conditions. Exit or termination in Agile does not need to be a taboo word. It's not something that's forbidden, right? In fact, it's across the industry, enterprises and providers both are realizing that it's a good thing to keep it streamlined because it keeps the necessary level of pressure on the provider, right, in the right way to drive the right behaviors to perform, right, and also an equitable view for both parties to leave and avoid further investment if they clearly know it's not working, right? So that also lowers the barrier for enterprises to try this more and more, as opposed to just being scared of getting stuck in something that they can't get out of. The fourth is our constant advice and message to both parties in any kind of contract, and it's very applicable in the Agile space as well. Any kind of gain share clauses need to be accompanied by pain share as well. It's never a one-way street. So whenever in a mature environment, if you're looking at gain share, be sure to share some kind of the pain as well, because that's what makes it equitable. The fifth thing to bear in mind is ensuring clarity on IP rights for partially live systems and allocation between both parties. Right. So this is a bit of a tweak to what we've seen in traditional contracts, but needs to be done because should there be any kind of stoppage of product or project midterm, one should be very clear about what the IP right, where the IP rights stand, because the product may not be fully developed. Pricing models need to incentivize speed and innovation versus eye on the wallet. Having said that, it's not that every time it's got to be a T&M. We spoke about other models as well, but they, again, similar to kind of the first point around the merit of the project, even the pricing models need to look at the merit of the project and then be applied. The seventh point, which is the most important, and Jimit touched on this at multiple points in his initial talk. No agile washing, right? So please, it's important to ensure that an agile contract is not a coat of agile paint over what's essentially a traditional waterfall-based construct. And this could happen. We've seen this in many cases where either projects which are essentially waterfall and evolve to agile just for development, right? So even though the planning has all been in the traditional fashion, or embracing agile happens when actually time is running out, right? So this is very, very important. Be true to yourself, be true to the merit of the project, and then apply agile rather than just applying agile for a tick in the box. So with that, I'll hand it back to Alan. Alan.
So I think
I'm sorry, I was talking, I apologize. What I was saying is I want to thank everyone for this. Obviously, we had a lot of content to go through today. We've got about 2 minutes for Q&A, and what we're going to do is I'm going to jump right into it. And if we don't get to your questions, and there were a lot, please feel free to reach out to us and we will be glad to answer them. But why don't I start out with Jimit? First of all, I have a question here. The question is fundamentally then, with everything we're saying today, is Agile taking us back to the days of staff augmentation?
Well, it's a great question. In some ways, from a contracting perspective, what we are seeing is that Agile is indeed easier to contract for when we are trying to begin in a more of a model which is T&M oriented. As organizations mature, yes, you can do price per sprint, etc. But our guidance for people who are starting off is to think of it as a staff augmentation play.
Gotcha. Okay, great. The next question I have here is, okay, and this is also, I think, Jimit, for you too, is what do you see as some of the popular frameworks for deploying Agile at enterprises?
All right, so there's a bunch of them, right? And most of them have common similarities, but then there's also nuances. You just need to pick one and stick to it. Scrum is obviously the most popular one. Some organizations will use Kanban. SAFe is, so the Scaled Agile framework is another framework that's becoming popular. And then there's another one called DAD, Distributed Agile Delivery, given the amount of disciplined Agile delivery. So I'd say that there's these four that we see most commonly. Most organizations pick one, tweak it slightly to their needs to drive the results they need.
Great. Okay, I've got one last question for you is, will you still need SDETS and possible exploratory engineers who test the edge cases manually, but have real business domain expertise?
Yeah, I think this question is in response to the comment I made about the diminishing requirement of the test COE, and I think the emphasis is on diminishing. Absolutely, you're going to need specialized domain skills to make sure that the software that's delivered to you meets all business and technology requirements. So we don't see independent testing fundamentally going away, but hopefully organizations are able to shrink the hundreds and thousands in some cases of testers within their COEs as they kind of scale their agile programs.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I know we're at the end of our hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Hopefully this was helpful. And like I said, We had a number of questions. As you can see on the screen also, we have related content on our website if you're interested, and please feel free to reach out. I'll close by mentioning our next two upcoming webinars. On October 3rd, we're going to have a webinar of Human and Technology, the Impact of Emerging Technologies on Integrated Services Delivery. And on October 3rd, we're going to ask the question or talk about the question, is your shared services center or GIC driving the digital agenda? And that'll be on October 16th. Once again, want to thank everyone. We hope you have a great day, a great night, and hopefully we will speak to you on October 3rd, if not sooner. Thanks, everyone.